Welcome to the Funnel Reboot Podcast with your host, Glenn Schmeltzley. Let's get into today's show.
Hey, Glenn here. Welcome back to Funnel Reboot, the podcast for analytically minded marketers. Here's what's on today's show. People resist change. They only stop resisting when they're convinced the change is needed. They're only convinced that change is needed when they grasp the truth. And the best way to present them with the truth is with data. Now, you might think that works on people by giving them a dry, statistical presentation of the data in all its indisputable, inscrutable glory. Nope, because those who want to avoid change will just give themselves off-ramps by arguing with you about your data. History shows that to persuade people to take an action, it takes going through the data in a way that they understand and feel emotionally. Here's a few examples. Florence Nightingale in 1854 wrote about and helped British soldiers who were dying in Crimea because of subpar medicine. She did this by writing back to London, talking about how soldiers were dying just as much from the sickness spread through hospitals as they were from battle. And she gave mental pictures, like saying, quote, typhus and dysentery are killing more soldiers than the enemy. She also used pie charts to show the military brass that, quote, they had in 7 months of the Crimean campaign more deaths from disease alone than had happened in the Great Plague, unquote. Well, this sparked a total restructuring of how the War Office managed health, and it led to drastically reduced mortality rates, it turned nursing into a profession, and modernized entire hospital practices. A more modern example is Al Gore, who in 2006 tackled climate change in his talk, An Inconvenient Truth. On a stage with an enormous screen behind him, he displays CO2 concentration levels over Earth's history.
Now, if you'll bear with me, I want to really emphasize this point. The crew here has tried to teach me how to use this contraption here, so if I don't kill myself, I'll...
He then steps into a hydraulic scissor lift and starts raising it.
It's already right here. Look how far above the natural cycle this is, and we've done that. But ladies and gentlemen, in the next 50 years, really in less than 50 years, it's going to continue to go up. When some of these children who are here are my age, here's what it's going to be in less than 50 years.
The point on the chart is already at the top of the screen, but he continues to raise the lift.
You've heard of off the charts. Within less than 50 years, it'll be here.
Gore's advocacy helped to build the momentum that led to the Paris Agreement Global Climate Accord, which was signed by 195 countries, which was over the threshold needed to make it into law. Princess Diana, in 1997, waged a campaign against personnel landmines. Here's her speech from a trip she made to Angola to personally walk through live minefields.
It's an enormous privilege for me to be invited here to Angola in order to assist the Red Cross in its campaign to ban once and for all anti-personnel landmines. There couldn't be a more appropriate place to begin this campaign than Angola, because this nation has the highest number of amputees per population than anywhere in the world.
The result of this, in 1997, shortly after her death, was the Ottawa Treaty, which banned these kind of mines in 122 countries. This is more than just history. It has something to do with marketing. Here's why. To do what we do, our bosses users/clients must be convinced in how our work is yielding results. That is the core of every story that every marketing presentation tells. I'm glad to say we've got help on how to do this. Our guest is a data storyteller. After graduating from Massey University, she moved into data analytics and earned a digital design degree in 2015. In 2016, she founded Rogue Penguin, a company focused solely on bridging analytics and business operations. And she leads workshops for professionals in data science and marketing and design. Let's go to New Zealand to speak with Kat Greenbrook. Kat Greenbrook, welcome to Funnel Reboot.
Thank you. I'm very pleased to be here.
So good to have you. You have a book that you've put out. What is the name of the book?
I do. It came out in December last year, so December 2023. It's called The Data Storyteller's Handbook.
Okay. And we've heard about doing data presentations. Listeners to this show have also heard about how marketing can sometimes have story elements. Maybe you can tell us what you would say gives a lasting effect to some data that we're presenting if we wrap it into a story.
Yeah, I think this is kind of twofold. There's, first of all, the audience. You have to make whatever way you're communicating your data relevant to the people that you're communicating. So a big mistake people can make when they're doing data communication is when they communicate in a way that's fit for themselves and they don't think about the audience at all. And we see this a lot in the way in which data is presented. So if maybe you're an analyst and you have to communicate the data that you've analyzed and you like to receive things in a lot of detail, then you communicate that information in a lot of detail. And that's not always going to resonate with the audience that you're trying to educate. So audience is one part of it, really understanding more about them and making sure the way you communicate fits their communication preferences. And then the next part is actually the story. And this is just understanding the data enough to really be able to tell a story or communicate via narrative, because that's going to also help engage the audience with the message. And sometimes when people communicate data, they will put it up there, just put the numbers up there and think that it communicates for itself. Whereas if you have the right audience who understand and have the context, yes, that does work. But for storytelling, it's about communicating to an audience who doesn't necessarily understand a lot of what that data means and doesn't have that background or context to go with it. And so therefore narrative helps to weave in that information in the way it's communicated so your audience truly understand what that data is representing.
I think the thing that stopped me in my tracks was just the realization we have data that is visualized, but there's actually two ways that data can be used. Sometimes we pick the wrong way to do it, or we actually approach the problem in a wrong way. So if I'm just trying to figure out what some data means, you call that discovery. And, that's something that practically only the person who is analyzing the information needs to automatically see. It may or may not be helpful for other things. That other thing is mainly communicating, right? And I'm trying to express it for others. And then you put this subdivision off of communicate to say, well, are these things where that audience is very well versed in the topic and they just want to be informed of like where we're at now, or they're actually not that familiar and they need to be educated through the information and the way that you are presenting it. So can you help make those distinctions clear for us?
Yeah, you absolutely nailed the definition. So discovery visuals are created generally as part of the analytics process. So they're used as a tool to help uncover some of those initial insights. They help see the data in a different way so it's easier to understand. And those visuals are they're pretty messy, they're unordered, they probably look rainbow colored because you haven't really taken a lot of time to change any of those default settings. And that's okay. Sometimes these visuals are referred to as chart vomit because they're just produced one after another in a very quick fashion. And they can be seen as a negative thing. But I think these visuals, for the purpose that they're designed for, which is to uncover those insights, they do a really good job at doing that. The problem with those discovery visuals is when you share those visuals with other people, because those discovery visuals are created only for the person that is designing them. So they shouldn't be shared with anybody else. So the other two types, inform and educate visuals, they're both forms of data communication, as you said, because they're designed for somebody else. And so you need to take into account who that somebody else is when you're designing them. So when you're designing an inform visual, these visuals are produced for someone who is maybe a subject expert or who understands the data a lot. And so those inform visuals, they don't need to worry about including any context in the way in which they're created. They purely are there to make the data easy to access. And you see this kind of visualization when you're producing dashboards. And so dashboards are full of inform visuals. They make it very easy to see the latest measurement. They make it very easy for somebody who has a lot of context on the data to be able to understand it quickly and make decisions based on that dashboard. Whereas if you put someone who didn't have that context or background and gave them a dashboard, they might look at it and think, well, what does this mean? What am I supposed to take from this? What is the significance of a high or low number for that metric? I don't know. And when you have an audience like this, you still need to communicate data to them, but a dashboard is not going to work. So an informed visual is not going to work. You need to go to the next type of visual, which is these educate visuals. And these are the ones that you use when you're trying to communicate via data storytelling, because they help weave that context and that background and that meaning of data into the way in which it's visualized. And they make it a lot easier for that particular audience, that knowledge-seeking audience, to truly understand what that data means. And so it is all about trying to figure out, who am I designing for? Is it myself? Is it somebody else? And then figuring out, if it is somebody else, how much do they already understand about the data? And so that will dictate how you design your data visual.
I wish I had had this kind of information years ago. And I think it was, there are harmless times when I've run afoul of this. The harmless part is, let's say that I make a short little presentation or a visual showing some data, maybe something like a filtered dashboard, and there's a fair number of KPIs on it, and another person in my team says, that's great, I need to go meet with a cross-company team, or I need to go present to my boss. Can I just grab that from you? Or can you just send that out to them? And I'm sure that, they'll enjoy seeing it as well, and it will get a favorable response from them. And I've done that, and either crickets or worse, furrowed eyebrows and questions like, what is this? And if I'd only listen to what you've said and understand that when we're talking to another audience that doesn't have the context, they need the context. So they will need a totally different visual, or at the very least, something with a lot of annotations on it. And that we actually shouldn't even attempt to use that. We should reset. And when we're trying to go between different groups, we should do what we have done for thousands of years when we try to get information from one person to another person with a total different expertise. And that is, we should try to think of a story. Right?
Yeah, it's a very common situation that you just shared. When somebody understands that the data in a dashboard format, thinks it's amazing because they can quickly access all that information. But then you're right, when you share it with somebody else who doesn't have that background, you will get exactly that response that you described. And it's not the case that the dashboard isn't working, it's just the audience isn't prepared for it. And you can change this by actually giving that context in the form of maybe a presentation first, or you can lead people into being ready for a dashboard by giving them maybe a data story first to give that context, and then they'll have that information to be able to understand the dashboard. So it's just really understanding, what does my audience currently know about the data that I'm sharing? Where do I need them to be? And then trying to bridge that gap a bit.
Right. Another thing you pointed out, which I wish I'd asked my boss, would be, what does the other audience need to get from this? What's the outcome? Are we looking to ask them to say yes to budgets? Or are they one step back from that, just taking some interest in this and want to understand how they're impacted? Or maybe at the lightest level, do they just want to be updated on seeing that we have something? And we need to tailor what we're going to send out depending on how light or how heavily they will be engaged by the information we're sharing.
Yeah, it sounds really easy, doesn't it? We need to understand what we're trying to achieve, but it's amazing. We so often forget that data storytelling, data communication, it is a form of communication, and when we communicate, we do need to have a reason why in which we're doing it. And when we share data, a lot of the time we just share it. We just put it out into the ether and hope that somebody will come across it and do something that's going to be amazing and create some sort of a positive business impact. Whereas this is generally not the case, and this is why we seem to be drowning in dashboards in the organizations that we're working with. We have all this information available, but it's not necessarily creating the business change that we hoped it would. And part of it is that we just don't know what we're trying to achieve when we share this data. And so we end up surrounded by it, but actually not having it doing much in a positive way.
Right. So we get to the point where we know the data well enough that we might be able to wrap it in some kind of a story, and you have a warning for us first. You say, or in my words, it's don't concoct the story and then just to go find data that supports it. We're not ever endorsing that. We are hopefully good enough at doing analysis that we're faithful to actually what the data is statistically saying. But the story doesn't necessarily jump out at us. And I think you point out that we have to poke it for a while until kind of that story emerges. Can you tell us about the two main types of stories that we might eventually get into? And we're kind of jumping ahead, but if we try to say whether this is something where we're trying to describe something over time, or this data represents a character and there's something that happens and develops to that character that we need to follow. Just tell us a little bit about those kind of big two branches that we may be working our way down to as we are trying to look for the story in the data.
Yeah, so there are two types of data stories. So you've got time data stories, as you mentioned, which focus on how a character is changing. So when I say character in a data story, I mean whatever the data metric, the main data metric is describing. And so generally you'll have a lot of data metrics when you're communicating as part of a data story, but there will be one that is the focus. And so if you're trying to find the right building blocks for your data story, try and pick one key data metric, because that will help you set the scope of that story. And these time stories, they use time as a way of contrasting a data measurement. So you can imagine you could have some sort of changing data metric, maybe it's return on investment, seeing how that's changing over time. You could say, well, 12 months ago, our return on investment was this, but today it's this, and therefore, what are we going to do about this difference? And so we're using time as a way of contrasting those measurements. Whereas the other way you can add contrast to a data story is through different characters. And this could be something like, well, this business is doing it this way, but our business is doing it this way. Therefore, how are we going to improve or whatever, or it could be this customer segment is showing this response to their campaign, but this other customer segment is not responding at all. Therefore, what's the difference? How are we going to analyze that further? And so it's just these two types of data story. They're a way to add contrast into the way in which you tell your data story. And contrast is really important when you're doing data storytelling, and you can introduce it in multiple different ways. But this is just one way in which you can introduce it through data. And it's really important because it does, with this particular, having contrast with data measurements, it helps make whatever metric or measurement you're describing more relative. It makes it, is this measurement high or low for this? Is that a good or bad thing? And it just adds some relativity into the way in which you present data metrics. If you presented a data measurement and you just presented it alone, if your audience doesn't have any kind of context around that data measurement, that wouldn't mean anything to them. But at least when you share it with another measurement, you can relate it to that. So it's one of the ways in which you can introduce contrast to your storytelling.
Perfect. And when we're trying to take the character route, one of the things you make abundantly clear is that if I'm presenting as a marketer, the business side person, analyst, whatever, I'm not the character. It's not about me. It's not that I found something. I have to find that character that the data is expressing. So if it's a website visitor, or if it is an end user, but maybe not a buyer, so think of like, if we're talking about how maybe we're a baby food maker and we're selling, something that is used by babies, but it is bought by parents. We have to think about who these characters are and how we're going to be able to tell their story. And you point out that you're following a tried and true method for how we tell the story, which many of us who've ever seen a play, something like a Shakespearean play or something even newer, it's going to follow a 3-act structure. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so the 3-act structure, that has been around for centuries. It dates back to Aristotle. It's been used a lot since then. But the structure that I follow was one originally introduced by Randy Elson. He works in science communication, but it's called the and, but, therefore, or ABT. And it's a nice way of being able to weave those 3 acts into a format that's very conversational. And I can give you an example. This one's from the book. This is just that 3-act structure that ABT used to describe a movie plotline. So I'll tell you that story. Africa's animal kingdom is ruled by lions, and Simba is a young lion who will succeed his father Mufasa as king. But when Simba's Uncle Scar murders Mufasa, Simba is tricked into thinking he is responsible and flees his homeland. Therefore, Simba needs to overcome his guilt before he can take his rightful place as king. That's an example of the and, but, therefore structure. And it's pretty simple, right? So these 3 words help just to incorporate those acts into a way that it can be used for any kind of communication. So when I first learned this, I was writing emails this way. I was doing presentations this way. Any chance I got to incorporate this or to practice this structure, I was using. And if you watch any kind of news reporting, you'll see that they use this structure all the time. And so it does exist around us in a very everyday format. We just need to be familiar with it so we can recognize it and start to build our own narrative intuition up, because it is just practice. And the more you use it, the more you recognize it, the easier it will be for you to incorporate into your work. And this same structure can be applied to data storytelling. I can tell you a data story in that structure if you like.
Go for it.
So this one is about Canada. So the and but therefore looks like this. Canada is the 5th largest natural gas producer in the world. And it uses half domestically and exports the rest to the US. But as technological advancements make natural gas more abundant, the US is set to go from a net importer to a net exporter. Therefore, the US will reduce its reliance on Canadian imports, negatively impacting Canadian natural gas producers. So that's an example of how you can use that structure to help communicate a message of data. And so it's exactly the same structure. You're just using it as a way to organize your content or organize your message in a way that's hopefully going to resonate a little bit more with whoever it is that you're talking to.
Yeah, that's great. And I'll make two quick comments on that. Number one, as a Canadian, it's, just as an ordinary citizen, there's some aspects to that take me through some emotional highs and lows. Now I can only imagine what a policymaker is going to do, hearing that same information. But, and that's the beauty of story, right? It makes you feel. The other side is, though, for any of the naysayers who say, no, we must show a busy table with a whole bunch of numbers in it, I would defy you to think of a data table that you could show somebody that would have the same impact. Now, Kat is, just telling this story, but if you imagine that it was complemented by visuals that had a few specific numbers and a few specific charts that backed up what she was saying, so there was actual numbers behind the trends, you have yourself a data story. I think you did that extremely well. And I want to hear how we might do it to a time story, but we're going to take a very quick break before we do that.
I want to pause for a PSA about all the people, places, and concepts mentioned in shows, along with timestamps marking various topics that we go through. You might want to catch those afterwards. Not while you're listening, because you're driving or cooking or doing something else. Fortunately, you can get to all these in the show notes via a digest email that comes out with each show. To subscribe, go to the Funnel Reboot website and use the sign up form that pops up. Let's get back to our guest.
Can you tell us how a time story works? Now, we're definitely switching away from that kind of story arc that we had before, but you say that there is just as much structure to a time story. As a matter of fact, you've come up with 10-question canvas that guides us through how to make a data time story. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, so the canvas is a way of editing the results from analytics. And this is generally used before you put your narrative or your ABT together. And it's a way of making sure that you've got all the building blocks you need to be able to write a narrative that is encompassing the bigger picture, to make sure that you've got all that contextual information before you start doing the ABT. So the canvas looks at just gathering or making yourself ask those questions from the insights that you've gathered, or making sure that you've analyzed the information in a way that makes it more. It makes it easier for you to tell a more bigger picture story. So the canvas has building blocks in it, like asking you for the reason. So when you're looking at a change that's happened over time with a particular data metric, asking you why that happened. Sometimes we don't understand the reason for that change. We just see the change, and so therefore we report the difference in metric. But actually understanding, okay, why did that happen? And it's also got a building block in there for trying to figure out, what do we not know about the data that we're analyzing? Sometimes this can be really important to acknowledge. There will always be things that you don't know about the data that you're looking at. And this can sometimes actually be incorporated into a story that you tell. And so having just a time to reflect on, yes, I've analyzed this data, but what is it not telling me? Or what information do I not have yet that I need? And it's also got building blocks in there about reaction. So how do you actually react to what you're seeing with this data? What did you learn from what you've analyzed? What can be done to remove some of those unknowns? And also what can be done to improve the impact on the business or the character, whatever it is that you're looking at? Sometimes we don't think enough about that, especially when we are analyzing data and that's our sole job. Our job might be to analyze the data and to put it up to somebody else to make future calls on or make next step calls on. And it's good to really understand a little bit more about what some of those next steps might be. And this comes down to really understanding the reason why you're communicating in the first place. And it's about having that business acumen that is necessary for storytelling. When you don't know anything about the business that you're analyzing, you're just looking at it from a data perspective, it becomes very hard to communicate the relevance of what you find to people working in that business. So you do need to understand a little bit more about, okay, when I present you this data, what are you going to do with it? What kind of decisions are you going to be making from it? Because then it becomes a lot easier for you to weave that into the way in which you communicate, which makes it a little bit more relevant to the audience that you're talking to.
Yeah, so the audience that is going to be eventually hearing this is likely not the focus. So in the case of marketing, right, we as a company team are listening to how marketing is impacting a potential customer. So I love that you said that there's some unknowns, because that's where we would get a chance to say we are missing some important data sources at this point in time. We don't have enough. And if I say took off a marketer hat and put on my journalism hat, you could start to ask the who, what, when, where, why, and how. And if I didn't have one of those, then if I were a reporter, I would grab my little spiral notebook and my pen and head off, go find it from people. In marketing, we have probably a little bit more work to do. Maybe we have to run an A/B test, or maybe we have to go out and do some qualitative surveys. So we have to acknowledge that that's an issue that we have to deal with, but the canvas has a spot for all of that.
Yeah, that's right. And I just think sometimes we see what's in front of us. We see the data that we've analyzed, and we see one of the pieces of insight that we can take away from it. And sometimes when we've pulled out one piece of insight, we run with that. That can be fine for some situations, but we can also be missing some other stories or the bigger picture if we don't think about the fact that this is just one slice of reality, this particular data set that maybe we're looking at. What else is out there to really complement our understanding that we don't know yet, or we haven't looked at yet, or is not available to us? And just because we've analyzed one data set doesn't mean we know everything that there is to know about whatever it is we're looking at.
And I love how you've tied it in with simple things like if we were talking about a business and we wanted to tell a story about customer loyalty, if we didn't go and get some information from our financial people or maybe from our customer service people about churn, we wouldn't have a full story to tell. This is the character of the story, right? The soul of it. We have to try and make sure that we have as much information as possible. I would imagine if I wanted to go and present on a certain time data story and I found I didn't have, I might just tell people, you know what? Can you wait a few weeks? We'll come back and we'll tell you about this, but we're not quite ready. Reading your book, I wish I had had the gumption to do that in some cases rather than rush to present and have left people with more questions than answers.
Yeah, it's funny because we all think that we need to have all the answers. And we really don't. We work in most of us, a large organization, that there are other people there to complement our understanding or to complement the way in which the business is going to operate. We don't have to know everything. So if we're talking about that whole customer churn example, I can give you a data story on that. You could say something like, last year we had 20,000 customers and we held a large proportion of the market share. But this year, customer numbers dropped by 25% because of increased competitor activity. Therefore, we need to do something to win back our customers. Now, the person presenting that doesn't have to know what we need to do. They just have introduced the fact that it's because of competitors that our customer numbers have dropped. Now it's up to you to figure out what the next step is. What is our retention strategy? And so when we share data, sometimes we think that we can't put a message on it because we don't know everything. We don't have all the answers, but we don't need to. And that should never stop anybody from trying to present data in a way that's going to be easy for our audience to understand. It's not about having all the answers. It's just about communicating what you know.
And when we're figuring out how to segment the pieces of what we know and order it logically, you've suggested a 4-part framework. It's PIAG. Can you just take us through that?
So this stands for the problem, goal, action, impact. And this is about how to understand the world in which your data story will exist in. And it comes down to what I was saying before in terms of understanding the business. And so generally when we're trying to create some sort of positive business impact, there's a pretty straightforward pathway in which we can get there. And so it's about understanding what is the problem that we're trying to solve here? What is the problem? What is the business struggling with at the moment? When we understand that problem, we can turn it into a goal. So what are we going to now try and achieve in order to minimize the problem? Now, goals are only achieved through actions. And so the next step is to think about, okay, we want to achieve this goal. What are some actions that we can take in order to get there? And impact is only created through actions. And so by doing these actions, you would hope that it would eventually create some sort of positive impact from it. But understanding those four pieces, so the problem, the goal, the action, the impact, you can actually incorporate some of that information into the way in which you tell the data story. And it just provides a more strategic lens on the data story that you're communicating by having this business understanding or this bigger picture understanding. It will help make your data story a little bit more relevant to people that may exist in teams removed from you who don't necessarily understand exactly the project or data that you're analyzing, but you can help to make it relevant to them if you know a little bit more about the wider goals in which you're working within.
Right. So it kind of overlays, in my mind, the and, but, therefore. We have to simply put problem kind of preceding all of that. But, the problem is maybe, as you say, what the world is, or maybe at our organizational level, what is being addressed. And then we can say, all right, so, and then we have beside that let's say, our internal goal of what we want for the buyer, but, maybe the context that the buyer works in and the other choices that they have, and how maybe our offering is inferior to others out there, then the consequent action or reason why the customer is doing what they're doing. But then you leave it in a beautiful place where we can measure the impact, but we can also see, even if we don't know the intimate details of this, we can see what we might need to do to fix it.
Yeah, so if you incorporate the problem, goal, action, impact framework into the ABT, you can almost create yourself a little elevator pitch for the work that you do. So you can say something like, the business is struggling with this particular problem, but I'm doing this particular thing to try and achieve this goal. Therefore, I'm hoping to create this kind of impact further down the road. And it becomes a very nice way to sum up the work that you're doing and sell it to other people within your organization. And in order to be able to fill in the last bit, therefore I'm hoping to create this impact, you need to have a little bit more understanding of what is going to happen when you've done your action. So and an action is anything that you are working on right now. So the project that you're working on right now, that is a business action. So hopefully you are doing that to achieve some sort of goal. Hopefully you know what that goal is. When you've achieved that goal, what's next? Because that's where your action lives. So that's where your impact lives. And the impact of your particular action is not necessarily something that you can control, because it may be done by other teams, but it is something that you're helping to influence. And so being able to answer the question, when you've finished what you're doing, what happens next? What does that lead into in terms of business impact? That will help you fill in some of those building blocks.
Great. And when we're now, let's say, at the stage where we've put it all together and all we need to do is communicate it ourselves to our stakeholder audience, you talk about how we need to be careful with what we put. So we've already talked about chart vomit. We don't want to do that. We instead want to be judicious in our use of data visuals. We should, in fact, you say, don't use them unless they absolutely tie into the story. So, maybe you leave something on an appendix slide, but only put the things in front. And then the other big thing, and I'd love you to give some flavor around this, is you're trying to use any means possible to show contrast, right? So you're either numbers, or you sometimes got icons, or you've got size of things, or color. Like you throw all the tools in the toolbox at contrast. Tell me what we're doing here. What is this helping as far as the prominence? And I mean the prominence of, if there's a number of things that our audience watching this presentation has to absorb, you're making it very clear to us that we should only show things when we have clearly given them, made it in a way so that they see what to look at first, and then maybe what also to look at. But we should never try to give them several things to look at once.
Yeah, so when you're telling a data story, so generally you have already written the data story first. So just like we've talked about previously, the ABTs, they're data stories, are examples of data stories. And it's very hard to create a visual if you don't know what your story is. And I see people doing this all the time. When they're doing or trying to do data storytelling, they jump straight into creating their visuals without truly understanding any of what comes before that. So they don't know why they're communicating, they don't know who they're communicating to, and they don't know what their message is. And it's very hard to tell a story when you haven't written it. So I do recommend people go and do all those three things first before they jump into looking at, okay, how am I going to tell this story? And visuals are only one way to tell a data story. So as we've just demonstrated, you don't need any visuals whatsoever to tell a data story. You can just speak it. Visuals, though, will help people see the data in a different way. They will help communicate or support the message that you're trying to communicate. And it's when you are creating a data visual, you should never create a visual and include it as part of a data story if it doesn't help to tell that data story. So you may have become very attached to a certain data visual, and I see this often. You'll have someone who spends a lot of time designing a beautiful visual and they want to show it to people. But if it doesn't fit in with your story, if it doesn't support your message, it doesn't belong there. So you may be trying to tell two different stories at once, in which case it's going to be confusing. It's going to create noise. Or it's just not good to put those two things together. So any data visual you include as part of a data story should always help to support that message. Now, when you're designing your visuals, there's two things that you need to ask yourselves. The first is, when people see my visual, what do I want them to take away from it? What is the key message or the key thing that I really want people to focus on when they're looking at my data visual? Now, if you had a dashboard visual and you ask someone, what are some insights that you gain from this? They'll give you a whole lot of different takeaways. And that's fine for a dashboard visual because you'll have subject experts looking at it who understand specifically what takeaway is important. When you're doing data storytelling visuals, you're creating these educate visuals, you need to be far more focused on what particular takeaway you want people to understand. And this can be spelt out as part of the title. That helps in order to communicate whatever it is that you're wanting people to take away from it. And it can also be spelt out in design contrast, as you mentioned. So design contrast is how you can play around with different design elements to make a certain part of your visual stand out more so from the rest of it. And this is how you get people to easily understand whatever your takeaway that's written in the title is. So you could have a title that's saying something about, I don't know, the most recent customer survey was very, very negative. That could be your takeaway title. And then you could show recent customer surveys and how positive or negative they were. But then you would use design contrast to highlight the most recent one. And it could just be making that bar or line a little bit darker so people are drawn to that part of the graph. And so it becomes very easy for people to read the title, understand the message they're supposed to take away, but then also go straight to the part in the graph that backs up that title. So you're making it really, really easy for people to understand your message. They don't even have to think about it. And that's the purpose of these visuals.
Yeah, I love that. And what I learned in reading this was I could also make the other bars lighter, and I can remove things that may not be so important, compared to the point of, all right, the main takeaway here is in the most recent, it's getting worse. So what you said that caught me was that the more things that you leave or, God forbid, add to the slide, the less prominence you are giving to the main thing that you want to. That contrast is only possible by making sure that there's a large divide between that one thing and, as you termed it, the rest. So don't put more of the rest in. Take the rest away as much as possible. Take so much away that any more that you took away would ruin the story.
Yeah, and that's it, right? So the more contrast you try to add to something, the less you have. And it goes back to that whole idea of not everything can be important, because if everything is important, nothing is important. So it's truly understanding what is the thing that I really need to highlight? What is my message? How am I going to push that to the forefront so my audience understand this one thing?
Beautifully put. So, Kat, this thing is called a handbook, and I want to return to that because you felt it was so important that you put it in the title, and we know that you're a person who doesn't put in things that don't belong. So, when we talk about it as a handbook, I think part of what I would say that means is that it's beautifully illustrated. There's a whole lot of ways that you are telling the story through data visuals, but you couldn't leave it at that. You had to actually go beyond and add some more stuff. Can you tell us about what else people might have if they are trying to put the teachings from the handbook into practice?
Yeah, so I wanted to do a handbook because there wasn't a lot out there in terms of practical resources that people could follow step by step in order to create a data story. There's a lot of books out there on data visualization. There's not so many on data storytelling. But this, for me, was a way of trying to give people something that they can actually have next to them and be able to refer to when they're doing their own data storytelling. And so a big part of it was to make it very, very practical. It was to make it easy to consume. I didn't want it to be too text heavy. And so that's why it is full of illustrations. I had this idea at the beginning when I started writing to create a picture book for adults. And it's kind of those two worlds, those engaging, easy to read, easy to consume way of illustrating children's books, but also having a very, very practical resource in terms of making the technical easy. And so that's how the book originated, and I hope it's formed somewhere in the middle of that space. But I also wanted to...
it lengthened the time that it took you to make this. You put in the acknowledgements that it was a 6-year project. So, it does take more to do it that way. And then you went ahead and you gave people a way of getting the templates that are used in the book.
Yeah. So I think once you have the book, it should be easy. It should be seamless. You should be able to make this part of your particular practice and data storytelling process. And so I didn't want to make it harder for people to do. So there are templates that are mentioned within the book, but then I've also made those templates free to download. You can look at them on my website, roguepenguin.co.nz, and they're all free to download. So if you see a template in the book and then you really want to use it in your own work, you can just go onto the website and download it for free. So I'm trying to make it really easy for people to follow along with this process and actually just improve their own data storytelling ability.
And if people want to reach out to you in particular, is LinkedIn the best place to go?
Yes, I am very active on LinkedIn. That's probably the only social media platform that I'm really active on these days. Or you can just reach out to me via the website. But yeah, LinkedIn or the website is probably the best way to get hold of me.
Thanks so much for coming on the show, Kat.
Thank you for having me. I've enjoyed it.
Until next time, I hope that all of you get better insight into your marketing so that you can make it even better.
Thanks for listening. Follow the show on Twitter at Funnel Reboot. If you like what you have heard today, please consider leaving a review wherever you get your podcasts.